Welcome back, chameleons, to the podcast of Aspie Answers as your host, Aspie Answers. Today I'm going to be bringing out episode 3 as promised, based on the self-diagnosis versus the diagnosis series, which in this case will be the series of the DSM5, which hopefully will be broken down to, as I said, 4 or 5 parts. So bear with me on this so that we can understand each other, or just gain a better understanding to what I'm about to share with you all. So this diagnostic manual is used in the UK, US, Europe and in New Zealand. It's developed or written by an American Psychiatry Association focused in North America. There are many different criteria that happens when diagnosing autism, as well as for other means of different mental health conditions. So I'm here to break it all down for us all to gain this better understanding today. Just to clarify, if that doesn't cover all the diagnosis for most categories or criteria around the world, but it will classify in the International Classification of Diseases Volume 11. The criteria in the Manual of the Classification of Diseases, or shall we say the DSM5 that's used, is the same but different, with the only one key difference found is the International Classification of Diseases that I'm mentioning. Just bear in mind, along with keeping in mind that the DSM5 and ICD sees autism in a distorted model as Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD, even though I have mentioned in one of my podcasts as well as my video series about Autism Spectrum Disorder, do we want to remove the word disorder, which hopefully I'll link it into my description if you want to hear my uptake on this, so on and so forth. Yeah, as we know, the term has been interchanged again of this to either be Autism Spectrum or Autism Spectrum Condition, as this is in turn operating on a deficit model where you have to have in turn some form of deficits in some areas to fit into the diagnosis criteria. Reading the report makes a small neurodiversity counter to cater to autistics, I believe. Apologise to the listeners that are in here that are listening to this term I'm using of deficit, which may trigger or upset some of you today, as I don't blame you, as this term makes me want to vomit and other mixed emotions as well, after based on my findings and research and what have you. So there are 3 types of subcategories in this diagnostic criteria, which I have broken it down here, as well as it will be continuing on in depth for the one of the DSM5, the New Zealand version. But just to bear in mind, category A, what's required to meet the requirements here is deficits in social, which means emotional sharing, example from abnormal social approaches, failure to initiate or respond to social interactions with their peers, maybe, and with socializing with someone in general. Classic examples here I want to illustrate to you all to give you a brief overview, hopefully an understanding, is you're meeting someone new, right? Talking about your special interests, not understanding the rules of small talk, and or also maybe understanding the rules, limitations of boundaries. What have you answer literally, you do your quick prompts of yes and no's, and you do basically short talk. I have struggled with this most of my life with this classic example in category A of maybe keeping short talk. Sometimes people notice with me I can go on for hours with my beloved interests, on and on and on. Sometimes people may feel, as an example also, I'm like a light bulb switch. One minute I'm doing, my beloved interest in talking to you guys, and then the next I'm just giving you short prep talk if need be. Sometimes I'm saying this also, this will vary from different autistics, but for me, with that everyday struggle with this, I tend to try my hardest to let the receiver understand me, as well as also on the receiving end give them a chance to talk to me, to have a decent conversation. Sometimes it may go well, sometimes it may not, depending on who you are. Sometimes I do approach with care, so to speak. I am not always careless and stuff, but I do allow for people to have that given time of day to actually talk to me and what have you. In saying this, also based on my everyday struggle for this short talk, sometimes also, like, depending where I am and stuff and how I'm feeling, if I'm going through a meltdown shutdown phase, which hopefully I'll address this later on in one of my podcasting series of meltdowns and shutdowns and traumatic experiences with autistics, or just trauma in general, that I'm like sometimes may end up not talking to you at all, depending on the environment and maybe how the person on the receiving end is actually responding to me, or how they will interact with me and what have, because as I said in one of my videos in the past, I came out of an abusive relationship thinking it was my fault, doing things that wasn't supposed to be tolerated between the pair of us, but it takes 2 to tango. Number 2, deficits in non-verbal communication behaviors, such as poorly integrated verbal and non-verbal communication to abnormalities such as in eye contact and body language, use of gestures to of facial expression, experience. Many of us autistics, obviously, we lack in that department based on reading body languages, lacking of eye contact, which I clearly shared in one of my videos about the reason to why us autistics do this. Is basically, I remember when I first was struggling with this, my everyday struggles, again, based on the traumatic experience of abuse, not making eye contact as well, via through bullying as well. So I had a bit of a traumatic experience, so therefore I am getting better with this everyday struggle. It just takes time, like anything, and practice. But as a key reminder, note here before I continue, don't forever force an autistic to make eye contact directly at you. They may be not listening in your perspective, but just bear in mind they are if they're looking away or maybe looking above you or what have you when they're doing this kind of distraction tool or what have you of not making eye contact, because we do obviously absorb everyday information what you give us. We're like an everyday sponge, like SpongeBob SquarePants squirting out water, if you know what I mean there. Hey, as you age, it's hard to make and keep friends. This is a given basically for many of us, because I believe that for me especially, I have managed to keep friends and maybe not keep friends. So in the balance line, it's just really hard when it comes down to socialization and trying to break down my walls of trust and what have you, especially after a few years of abuse. I'm coming out of my shell slowly. Many people may have known me now as really happy, joyful, what have you, but underneath it all sometimes it just feels like I'm masking how I'm really feeling because of fear of judgment and fear of just people just say, not just judgment as such, but it's just the fear of maybe what people may think and say about me, especially when it comes down to my anxiety levels of what comes in the territory of my autism or Aspergers Syndrome that I was diagnosed with, along with also, in saying this, it comes down to the territory of my social anxiety too, about the signs and symptoms, which I'll clearly share more about the signs and symptoms of social anxiety, or I will link it below somewhere in this podcast for you guys to listen. Also, it's at play, which will involve basically us to use our imagination. Many people think that us autistics and maybe many other kids with learning disabilities or what have you have a great imagination when it comes down to playing. Suppose in saying this, autistic girls going from group to group in a butterflying effect based on that, and it leads to positive reinforcement. And in saying this, also for us autistic girls, sometimes we get misdiagnosed early, sometimes it comes to a later date, and I'll tell you the reason why hopefully one of my series over. But in just saying this, that it has been classically known for a long time that this condition of autism was known for just as males way back in the 60s and what have you, but again, more of that later on. It's contradictory to teach each other. So in category B, however, in this diagnostic level, you have to meet at least 2 or 4 kind of criteria in this. So you've got inconsistent on sameness, inflexible abilities, adherence to routines or rituals that you may have, because obviously basically some autistics doesn't like routines, some doesn't like change obviously, and also in the sameness, the ritualized patterns of verbal and non-verbal behaviors, such as maybe extremities at small changes or what have you, as well as difficulties with just transitioning, rigid thinking patterns, greeting rituals to their peers or whoever they're socializing with. Sometimes they may need to take the same route or food every day just to feel the comfort, because obviously, as I said in one of my book series, that for me, I am trying to adapt to change as much as possible depending where I am in the environment versus the people I'm dealing with in the daily, which it can be really difficult for me, I'll admit, because not everyone is the same. I'll admit that, and that sometimes we need to gain a better understanding towards each other based on our differences. We can agree to disagree or agree to disagree of whatever we share. It's just not to spit the dummy and actually think that oh, I'm better than you, sort of macho kind of attitude. In saying this though, with the experiences with me, I had an anxiety experience like many probably autistics, not being able to control the environment or control what was going on of that everyday change, and I try to manipulate it and what have you, thinking that I can be in control, if that makes sense. In saying this, it's basically how I was when I found out before, during and after my diagnostics, which I'm getting a bit better, is just to know what I can and can't control of everyday situations. Some things are about to change, and I tell myself, okay, what needs to be changed, what doesn't, what can I do to make it better, and what have you. Is there any people involved that has maybe caused some disruption in my life or what have that doesn't belong in my circle, and so on and so forth, which I have clearly give you guys some tips and advice along the way on this. Number 3, autistic special interests. Have shorter or longer term interests. This is a given for some autistics. Some autistics may have like long time interests such as science or health or anime or some form of movie they watch on a continuum. And in saying this, also they may be looking at certain phases in everyday life that they quote on and what have you. As you're aware, if you've been following me via through my podcast, my blog, or even my channel, that I have clearly shared a little bit about me, about my interests, what I love to do and what have you. Most of it is a continuation of just doing it on a daily, busy, just in a form of escape sometimes, depending on my mood, depending on how I am feeling. Based on that mood is where it's going to take me and what have you, as well as the environment I'm in that type of mood. Sometimes the environment does play a key role here, as well as the mood changes of everyday things that we go through in our everyday life. So also in saying this, with special interest, this can open a new world and new opportunities for autistics and just people in general with maybe learning disabilities, because as I said before, for many of us autistics with our special interests, it can actually lead to a future career of our likes, so on and so forth. You might thank us later for many of us autistics because we have an attention for detail. Some of us will have a longer attention span and are knowledgeable and what have you, but again, as I said, every autistic is different, so just treat them with care and what have you. Just get to know them, do not judge them is my advice here. Just make sure you involve them, because I've noticed that with me, especially when I've been trying to involve myself in everyday activities, I put people off, maybe by first time appearances or first time name basis or whatever. But hopefully in saying this, that people can understand me better, not just as an autistic but just a general person as a whole. Number 4, sensitivity issues. Obviously, this is neurological and not behavioural. Some of it, many people may think, is attention seeking versus attention avoidance. I have shared about attention seeking and avoidance on the channel of what I am. I'm a bit of both, depending again where I am, what I'm doing, and who I'm dealing with at that given moment of time. Sometimes it's also in saying this, if it's based on the time pressures of what I'm doing, based in the environment. Say example, like a real good key one for me is like when I was in school, I had a certain time limit, like most kids, to do assessments or homework or what have you, and that sometimes try to do my darn hardest to put myself under pressure sometimes, see if I can handle pressure, but let's be real here, I wasn't. So I had to do what I normally do for the sake of my executive functioning and making lists and what have you, just to break down what needed to be done and saying this for that assignments. And I had them on my timetable sheet, what is due, when it's due, and what have you. I just broke it down, thinking to myself, okay, this needs to be done, and just break it down into chunks so it's easy workload for me. Quote me on this if you're listening, maybe to how you guys work on this, because everybody's different. So I would like to hear what you guys have to say on this. Also in saying this is, like, as I said, spoke this on my channel, but if need be, I can bring it out again on my podcast very soon anyways, based on probably the behavioural side of autism, if need be, which will hopefully, in saying this, be on later on, so stay tuned. So category C is symptoms may be present in early developmental period but may not become fully manifested until social demands exceed the limits and capabilities, or maybe masked by learned strategies in everyday life. Because obviously, again, as I said, autistics are good at masking, and I believe for us autistics, when it comes down to our masking strategies, that can be detrimental to our mental health, and obviously, in saying this, it can ruin our mental health, especially when it comes down to socializing with our peers. To me, I try my very darn hardest to mask how I feel and what I'm thinking sometimes, and just trying to act and fit into the neurotypical world, because obviously in this day and age with the neurotypical world, you're in a box full of expectations, and I feel that this is not the way to go. And I'm understanding that maybe some future employers will hopefully learn more about us autistics especially, or just people with different accommodation needs, so that they can meet it in general and actually be more fairer on us and not to discriminate us, because I've heard on the grapevine that many of us autistics and other people with different conditions, that they have been discriminated against based on it, of what they can do and can't do based on their limitations, and it's just not fair, I believe. So give us a chance if you want to hire us and what have you. If we do something wrong and it's not to your cup of tea or whatever, just show us your way of doing it and see if we work around differences as well of how we go about things. But at the end of the day, every autistic is different. Maybe you'll thank us later for what we learn and do differently to you guys, that it might be another way of just doing things and maybe doing it better, I'm not sure. And saying this is also basically, I believe that with my everyday struggles, as I said, that I used to, when I socialise in large groups, which I don't much now due to my social anxiety and what have you. I'm alright with a one-to-one interaction with people, but if it's a large group of people, say like if I'm about to give a speech, it just makes me nervous and all these other mixed roller coaster emotions, which is understandable for many of us that suffers from social anxiety. But in saying this, I feel I am getting better. It's just little baby steps at a time, as I keep telling myself, even though I do tend to push myself, especially someone else does. You may have seen him on my channel in the past, which I'm hoping to do more with him in the present for our everyday activities, or maybe going for more trips around New Zealand or what have you while we're in lockdown. I'm not sure yet, but you're gonna have to sit tight for that, for our future plans, if it does come to light or not. Last but not least is category D. Symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational and other important areas current functioning of everyday life, which you gotta remember. Basically this one is like classified under, I think, for category D is the ones that are the non-verbal autistics or the lower functioning autistics, which I hate using the term. Again, humble apologies to the listeners that are maybe trying to remind me to slap me on the knuckles about these terminologies. I can't run away from these terminologies, as I said before, so can you just please bear in mind what I'm sharing with you all. You need to rethink about it again in this category, I believe, because obviously the world is not yours, it's ours, of what we live in. We see things maybe differently to you, be it black and white or colours or whatever, but you may want to walk into our shoes and not judge us from hindsight that, you know, we're hard to handle or whatever it may be that you may be thinking. Also with this, parents will treat you with a different light and expectation of you, I believe. Like, I've noticed this with some adults that has kids with different learning disabilities. They have high expectations of their kids, even though some of us with learning disabilities, especially like I felt when I was getting diagnosed or nearing it, especially with my ADD, ADHD diagnosis versus my autism and everything, that I was falling behind the cracks or what have you. Many of us will be falling behind the cracks, and I feel like even though the education system here in New Zealand, since I'm a New Zealand Kiwi, for those of you who are new today, that we still got a long way to go for the education system, as well as some other systems that are broken. But I'm praying and hoping in future, regardless, for future generations especially, that it will become better for us all. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure that there has been some good systems put into place for certain children, especially now with this new education system of NZ.I, level 1, 2 and 3 in New Zealand. But I'll tell you more about my educational experiences on that later on in the piece though. But I believe that many parents, I'm not sure if I'm honest here, but I felt maybe in some ways that my parents just wanted the best of me, regardless of felt that they were fearing or what have you. I'm not sure if it's fearing, but I think they were doubting my potential, as well as someone else said I've got a high potential, which is virtually amazing what he said to me. Don't want to bring him into too much of this conversation of this first part of the series here, but what I'm saying is that, you know, many of us autistics do have high potentials and stuff, regardless of the expectation that is put upon us and what have you, I believe. And sometimes it can be really hard for us to just fit in and blend into the neurotypical world. I sure as hell find it hard, I must admit, because obviously differences of opinions, thoughts and what have you, and attitudes towards us sort of thing. I still believe to this day there's still a bit of stigmatizing for autistics. I could be wrong, but that's just me how I felt. There has been some people that has been understanding and appreciative of me, maybe on how I work and what have you, but like I said, I am just forever grateful to just do what I love doing right now, which is advocating to you guys, as well as educating you all on my life journey with autism, or Aspergers Syndrome as it was clinically called before we were put into the banned umbrella of Autism Spectrum. So I thank you for some of those who have come to meet and greet and actually been in my circle for maybe just a short period of time, mid-term or what have you, or some who may have been there for a long time, even if we don't, you know, commute too much to one another due to maybe our different everyday lives of what we go through. Some, you know, have their own way of thing. There is basically also with this is not autistic then, but are now diagnosing adults, because obviously that is a breaking point for us for these, you know, expectations. I must add, because many of us feel kind of guilty just because, you know, we've got all these high labels, these different labels, functioning labels especially, that can be damaging to autistics. And again, I'll share more about my uptake about the problems with executive functioning labels, or just labels in general, in one of my podcasting series, as well as link it hopefully in the description box of this podcast that I'm sharing with you all today. Some of us feel that also in this part of the category D is that we feel like we're suffering, or many people think we're sufferers or whatever, just because of, again, that functioning label for this will belong to the low functioning autistic that needs more help and assistance from others from the medical field, or even their caregivers, or whoever it may be. Also in certain things for category E, I forgot to add here before I end this, is the box ticking. Normal behaviour versus just normal behaviour. There is a barrier to language, obviously, as well as the language process in general. Sometimes also we need the interview and charts that needs to be given, obviously, on this category, because obviously there is some diagnostic criteria assessments that are given to us to fully fulfill, to make sure that we are actually autistic, as well as just anything in general, which I'll share later on in the piece, the different diagnostic criteria manuals, as well as everything else. So this ends, hopefully, as much as I can think of the first part. I hopefully enjoyed this and you learned something. Smash the like. If you want, comment below also, and share these to your family and friends, because as I said, I want to raise awareness and acceptance towards autistics who hasn't maybe got a voice in saying this. Thanks for listening and watching, and I'll see you again soon.
Also, where to find me, this again will be listed in the socials, but just to tell you right now, is Facebook is my Aspie.Answers, my Twitter again will be Aspie Answers, which they're both capital A. Spotify obviously is Aspie Answers, which is capital A, capital A. Patreon is my crowdfunding page right now. You can find me on patreon.com, Aspie Answers, basically. And for those of you who don't know what Patreon is, today, for those who are listening that are new, I have this set up for funding for future projects like this one of my podcast versus my merch that I've been designing, which I'll share more briefly soon about my merch update, or even in this podcast right now as I'm addressing this to you guys, is that it's like a crowdfunding page or funding page for creators like me, or content creators, music creators, whoever it may be, that's seeking out funding to support themselves in a way of, maybe say they need extra equipment for their cameras versus maybe their radio equipment if they were doing something similar like I am doing today, or covering their rent, travel costs, what have you. And in saying this, also basically for the merch, you'll see me basically maybe wearing it once in a while on my YouTube channel, as well as maybe, you know, out and about in public. And so in saying this, my merch site is spreadshirt.com, life-of-and-aspie. And another one you can find me on my social is for those who haven't, and I like to read instead of watching or what have you, as an alternative for you guys, is lifeofanaspieweb.wordpress.com. So this wraps up everything. I want to thank you all for listening right now. Follow me on the socials that were listed below. Subscribe, share this podcast to friends and family. You know, if you want to, feel free to become a Patreon to support this future project, as well as many others that is in the works as of this time. Feel free to, you know, donate, big or small, with me in this journey of it. And also my merch obviously will cover the cost for this as well. So I'll catch you all again on the other side. Aspie signing out for now, and bye.